All right, what we have today is kind of a high-speed, low-drag presentation on something. I only have a little bit of time, and I tend to go into the weeds. So strap yourselves in. I'll try to save time for questions at the end and kind of talk through what I'm talking about. All right, let's get started. I'm Charlie Harp. I'm the CEO of Clinical Architecture. I'm a simple country programmer. I've been developing systems in healthcare for about 35 years. And now I run Clinical Architecture, a data quality interoperability company. All right. Lord Kelvin said, when you can measure what you were speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. Basically, the idea here is if you can't really understand it and you can't describe it with numbers, then you really don't care about it and you really don't understand it. And I think that's very true. It's especially true when you talk about data and data in healthcare in particular. In this talk, we're going to talk about data quality in healthcare at a very high level. We're going to talk about the anatomy of a data quality measurement framework. We're going to talk about something that I put together called the PICI framework, the Patient Information Quality Improvement Framework. I'm going to walk through some examples, and then hopefully we'll have time for some Q&A, okay? High speed, low drag. So the first question is, what does quality mean in terms of healthcare? I'm not going to spend a lot of time belaboring this, but it really is the data reliable? Is it usable? Can I trust the data? A lot of when we talk about quality, we talk about trust and credibility. So if we can assess the quality of information in healthcare data, quality of information of healthcare data, what are the benefits of that? And I'm not going to read through these bullets because I don't have time, but basically what I'm going to tell you is the benefit is we know what's going on. If we can understand what the quality is, we can determine what we can do with the data, and if we can do meaningful things with the data, then we can do a better job in general, providing for patients, figuring out the economics of care, and everything else. And part of measurement, one of the important aspects of measuring something is if you can identify a problem and measure where it's coming from, then you have a chance of fixing it. Where if you don't bother to measure it, you're never going to fix it. So what I came up with is this thing I call the PICI framework. And I'm a developer, so acronyms are my minor study. And I thought about a bunch of different names. What I like about PICI is it kind of describes how I feel about quality of data. We should be picky about the data we use in healthcare. We shouldn't just take any data or let any data in. We should be particular about it. Now, the PICI framework is something that I put together after looking at a bunch of different research, looking at things that people were doing in OMOP and other areas, and I decided to do something a little bit different that I felt was a little more pragmatic when it comes to dealing with what I see in real healthcare, in the environment that we operate in. I see a lot of things both in HIEs and providers and payers, and so I wanted to come up with something that I could describe with numbers, that I could talk about. The first thing about the PICI framework is it's not an arbitrary quality framework. It's not like ISO 8000. It's very specific. It focuses on patient data because patient data has certain characteristics that are very important to patient data, like, coded entities and things like that. The next thing is, what I tried to do is have a minimalist model for evaluation of data. Now, this model could be applied to the framework could be applied to any model. I just wanted to simplify the model so I could take data out of anything. HL7, FHIR, CCDA, OMOP. I wanted to have a minimal set where I could pull out things that are absolutely critical and evaluate them without worrying about schema. Because a lot of the systems that I saw were about relational integrity and things like that. And I'm not so worried about relational integrity in a database. I care about the payload of the data and how we can evaluate it. The taxonomy of qualitative dimensions. Working in a terminology-oriented business, I really felt like having a way to describe quality is important. And there are a number of great scholarly articles about this. And I went through and I looked at a lot of different things, and I kind of cherry-picked the things that I felt like I was seeing in the real world that were super relevant, and we're not very esoteric. So I try to be pretty concrete about these things. And that's the taxonomy. The next thing is, when you ask somebody about quality, their answer is going to be subjective. It depends on what they're trying to do. There are some people, I might be able to accept sketchy quality under certain circumstances, but in other circumstances, I will not. It has to be super high quality. And so that's where this concept of an evaluation criteria comes in. When I'm looking at the quality of something, what I'm willing to accept depends on what I'm trying to do. And that can be variable. The level of quality can be variable. But the things that I measure tend to be the same things. It's just a question of whether certain things are acceptable. So the idea of portable, reusable, simple assessment modules that I can deploy, align to an evaluation criteria so that I can make a decision, and the idea of having them designed in a way where they're simple, they're true, false, I either pass or I fail, and ideally, I could pick that up and I could give it to you so that we don't all have to sit in our silos and reinvent the wheel, because we spend a lot of time doing that in healthcare. So let's talk about it a little bit deeper. First of all, I have this lovely picture. That's patient information. Patient information comes in, and regardless of how you look at it, patient information tends to follow kind of a standard minimalist model. And it's kind of what's expressed in US Core. If you look at US CDI version 3, there's kind of a basic model of information. There are elements they talk about relative to lab and meds and other things. And that's kind of what the picky information model is. It's a minimalist model, kind of modeled lightly after US Core. Then you have a taxonomy. The taxonomy, which I'll talk about in more detail, has these categorized dimensions that look at certain things at certain levels. Because in the data for a patient, you have things that are attributes, you have things that are elements, and you have things that are longitudinal. And you want to be able to assess quality on all those different levels, not just at the attribute level. Then you have your criteria, and you have a library of simple assessment modules that you deploy against the data. Those also align to the taxonomy, and you can decide how you gate the data. So you can either gate the data or you can score the data. 6 of one, half a dozen of another. And the ultimate end result is that you generate a report card against that evaluation criteria. So a good example, well, I'll get into that. Okay. So let's talk about the picky information model. The information model in picky falls into the following 4 categories. Patient, which is the entirety of the payload that you're evaluating. Data classes, which are the things that live within that payload that have the same information model, like labs and meds and whatnot. An element, which is an item in that data class, and the attributes that make up that element. And some attributes are made up of other attributes, like coded entities, for example. This is an example of the lab, the kind of basic lab information model. Now, what I did, and I'm from ASTM history, I've worked in HL7. One of the things I really wanted to do was come up with a tagging scheme that a human can communicate to another human with. Because I can talk to you about, OBX3 all day long. But if I want to talk to a developer about it and they're not steeped in HL7, I want to be able to say that it's this guy right here. The other thing we talk about is what's the data type. And then there are some that have different characteristics. They're not always going to be populated. Sometimes they will be. But the bottom line is, I want to be able to identify. I want to be able to identify the index of the element in the collection. And I want to be able to talk about these fields in a way that are meaningful. So I could have numbered these. I could have done a bunch of different things. This is just a tagging scheme that I came up with. The picky taxonomy falls into 4 major categories: availability, accuracy, conformity, and plausibility. Now, believe me, I spun on this for like 3 months, trying to look at the different ways and the different measures, and I came up with all kinds of wacky ideas, and this is kind of where I landed. And the idea is availability is whether or not something's there. Now, at an attribute level, something can be unpopulated. Like I don't have a units of measure field in my lab. Something can be incomplete. I have a lab element, but it's missing its units of measure data. And then I have the one at the top is a little bit more esoteric than that. The patient's a diabetic, but diabetes is missing. Now that's a quality issue. It's a more sophisticated quality issue than, oh, the field's not populated. But when you're looking at data and you're looking across data, you should be able to infer certain things and say something here is obviously missing. So that's just a way to indicate that. Accuracy, I kind of boiled it down to these 3 buckets, and believe me, I went all over the place. Whoops. Invalid format, it's supposed to be an integer, it's not. It's supposed to be a decimal, it's not. It's supposed to be a date, and it's not. The invalid value, it's supposed to be one of these 3 enumerated codes, and it's not. An invalid grouping, these things should not go together. These things do not belong together. So it's kind of like, it's like auto-advancing. It's kind of like, I'm going to show this, when it happens again, you'll see it, me holding like, see? Okay. And conformity, once again, in patient data, one of the things that's very important is coded entity. Coded entities are everywhere. And so when you start looking at how we evaluate coded entity, you have concepts like, is it a valid member? Is it what we agreed to? We said LOINC, what you gave me is not LOINC. And then the other one is, you gave me a LOINC code, but it's from 7 years ago, which it might be okay, but it's good to know that what you gave me is no longer current. And the last is my favorite, which is plausibility. Because plausibility, I think a lot of these things are basic, simple evaluators, but plausibility requires that somebody sits down and creates a module that says, you can't have a hemoglobin A1C of 10,000. So plausibility is looking at either an element, well, clinical implausibility is looking at an element and saying, yeah, this isn't right. This can't be right. It's an impossible value. Temporal plausibility is looking at data over time and saying this sequence is not possible. And situational plausibility, there's a ghost in the machine, is when you look across the patient and say, this patient can't be a cardiac hypertroph and also have an ejection fraction of 25%. That's not valid data. So these are all different levels that let you evaluate the plausibility of data, and that's a place where we should be able to build a standard set of evaluators and share it across healthcare, as an example. And the stuff on the right side is just me kind of saying, some of these apply to attributes, some of them apply to elements, which is a collection of things, and some of them apply to the patient data writ large. I am not going to go through these slides in detail. I'm just showing you that I'm not making this stuff up. So this is an example of some of the details around these different things. And you know, I'm a developer, so I give everything tags. I'm an old MUMS developer, so they tend to look like mnemonics. But at the end of the day, I think having these little tags, when I go to communicate data later, you can see the intersection of these things and say, aha, we're not putting decimal places in our lab result. That's what we're trying to get to. So availability, accuracy, conformity, plausibility, and I'm going to be releasing a white paper soon. If you guys want to get a copy of it, be happy to. We are going to be doing a proof of concept with this, with some of our clients and with some other data, because the proof of the pudding's in the tasting, and I really want to see how this performs when you actually deploy it against live data. The simple assessment modules, I think, are also really powerful. And if you think about them, and I've like super simplified them here, you have what is it, what type of thing can I apply it to, there's logic that goes along with it, there's a dimension that it aligns to, and there are required parameters depending upon the nature of the assessment. So here's some examples. An attribute is present. You give it a simple attribute. There's logic that looks to see if it's present. It aligns with the availability unpopulated dimension. So if I fail that, I know what dimension it is, and I can categorize. I can look across all your data and say, you know, 35% of your data has unpopulated attributes. So once again, my goal at the end of the day is to have a quality gauge that allows me to look at data in flight and say, when I look at your data, your average message looks like this, and here's where the problems seem to be coming from. You can look at some of these others, like coded entity is interoperable. In this case, you're doing a check, and you're just telling me what's the code system I agreed to. If it's not the code system you agreed to, you fail. And that's the other thing about SAMs. SAMs are true or false. You fail or you pass. There's nothing special or magical about them. It's how they align to the evaluation criteria where things get interesting. Now, when you think about an evaluation criteria, basically you're saying, hey, when I align an evaluation criteria, you can think of it as an orchestration of simple assessment modules, okay? Where you say, I want you to run these assessments, and these assessments have these actions. So you basically say, here's what you're running the assessment against, here's the sequence, here's the module I want you to run, here's the parameter, here's the gating effect. Because part of the value of something like this is if you give me a patient and the patient has 500 lab results, I can either pitch the whole patient out, or I can look at it and say 50% of the lab results look okay, 50% look bogus. So you get to choose, am I gating the patient? Am I gating the lab results that are bad? Okay? Or am I just issuing a warning to say, hey, you have issues with the data, but I'll still let it into my repository? And the last is the ability to assign an arbitrary score value, which may be better if it's not arbitrary. I'm still thinking about that. So here's an example of an evaluation criteria. Let's take something like USCDI version 3. And what I'm basically saying when I evaluate, and this is not the whole thing, it's an example. When I'm evaluating a lab result, I'm looking at the code system to see if it's present. These are all the same simple assessment module. It's aware of the field I'm pointing it at, and it's evaluating that field, and it's tagging the result to the field that I was evaluating with it, right? So when this guy fails, I know that it's this field, I know that it's this SAM, and I know that this SAM happens to be an availability dimension, okay? So I've got that triumvirate, for lack of a better term. And you can see that some of these are a little different, like the lab test coded entity is active. In this case, I'm just issuing a warning. I'm giving you a 5-point ding on your score. And in the last one, I'm saying, is it interoperable? Now, the ones that say required say, if you don't check the boxes, this guy does not go into my repository. Okay. All right. This is one of the things that I talked about a little bit, but when you design the evaluation criteria, you know that when you get data, you've got these elements, you've got data classes, they're sequenced, they have attributes. Some of the attributes, you have attributes, and one of the things you get to decide is when I get a failure on something like my code system, what does it gate? So in this case, if my code system fails, the test fails. If the test fails, the lab result fails. That lab result is not welcome in my repository. So I'm showing this one more time, just to kind of put it out there. We've come full circle. I told you it was going to be high speed, low drag. I wasn't lying. In fact, I think I'm already out of time. The benefits of this framework, first of all, standardized nomenclature for talking about quality. If we have a standardized nomenclature and we share it across the verticals of healthcare, when we're looking at data, we can say your data is bad because of this. And I can very cleanly articulate it instead of just saying your data gives me a bad feeling or whatever you might say. The next thing is, because it's only focused on the things that are relevant in the patient data, it's not looking at things that are not important to me. And the model is extensible. There's a lot of things you could do with it. But the idea is we want it to be relevant, and what's relevant goes back to what you ultimately care about in the evaluation criteria. And the last thing, and this is really important, we spend too much time in healthcare toiling in our silos. The idea behind this is if we could build a library of shared simple assessment modules, even if it's just the interface and the understanding of the taxonomy and the assessment module, then we can leverage that instead of doing a bunch of busy work in every single silo. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is that. Any questions? Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.